What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists. At a time when most people didn't believe that, he collected those evidences. And that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening, and thank you and welcome to Virtual Schaumburg. My name is Novella Ford. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions. And as you know, through conversations, performances, film screenings, exhibitions, and more, we explore historical and contemporary narratives that continue to shape Harlem, this nation, and the world. Thank you for joining us for Between the Lines, W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, an essay toward a history of the part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. This edition has been published by Library of America and is edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Eric Foner. Originally published in 1935, Black Reconstruction in America was Du Bois's groundbreaking study of the role that African Americans played during the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. Tonight is presented in partnership with Library of America and the New York Public Library Center for Educators and Schools. Special thanks to Max Rudin, the publisher at Library of America, and Dr. Brian Jones, one of my thought partners and director of the New York Public Library's new Center for Educators and Schools, which makes it even easier for educators to use the library's rich digital, circulating, and archival collections. Through the center, educators can access curricula, CTLE credit-bearing workshops, class trips, fellowships, and so much more. Tonight's program is part of a series of programs and workshops we developed around revisiting Du Bois's text. Our first two virtual workshops were interactive and really allowed an audience to workshop around teaching this text, as well as a close reading of passages from Black Reconstruction. Our final workshop is this Saturday, November 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In this particular session, we will discuss what is the work of abolition and reconstruction in our time. This workshop will be facilitated by Mariama Kaba, who is an organizer, educator, and curator, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice. Our programs are available virtual, and luckily we have started to also do in-person programs. So I invite you to learn more about the Schaumburg Center and our upcoming programs by visiting our website at schaumburg.org. Just a quick note on two incredible exhibitions that opened at the top of 2020 right before the pandemic, and one of which is closing this December, which is Traveling While Black, A Century of Pleasure and Pain and Pilgrimage. And the second one will close in February, so please look out for more information. Now I want to welcome to our virtual stage scholars Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Eric Foner, the editors of W.E.B. Du Bois Black Reconstruction. And the Q&A and conversation will be moderated by Kianga Yamada Taylor, who's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a recent MacArthur Fellow recipient. I will turn it over to you, Kianga.
Thanks so much, Novella, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It's probably fitting that we begin a discussion about the republication of, or the new edition of Du Bois's magisterial work, Black Reconstruction, with a reading from Professor Henry Louis Gates, then a reading following that with Professor Eric Foner.
Thank you, Kianga, and thank you, Novella, for that marvelous introduction. I'm going to start, ironically, not with Dr. Du Bois, but with perhaps the most immediate cause for Dr. Du Bois to take on the subject of Reconstruction. And that was a book, Scandalously Racist, published in 1929 by a man named Claude Bowers, and it's called The Tragic Era. And it was representative of this racist renditions of our people's contributions in the Reconstruction period, which were ensconced in the academy by the Dunning School at Columbia. But this was very popular, whereas Dunning was writing academic treatises and his graduate students were publishing monographs. This book was a bestseller in a selection of the Literary Guild. And it went through 12 subsequent hardcover printings. And as Eric reminded me this morning, it even found its way into opinions issued by the United States Supreme Court. And it is so shocking. I want to read a passage. Freedom. It meant idleness and gathering in noisy groups in the streets. Soon they were living like rats in ruined houses, in miserable shacks under bridges built with refuse lumber, in the shelter of ravines and in caves on the banks of rivers. Freedom meant throwing aside all marital obligations, deserting wives and taking new ones, and in an indulgence in sexual promiscuity that soon took its toll in the victims of consumption and venereal disease. Jubilant and happy, the Negro who had his dog and a gun for hunting, a few rags to cover his nakedness, and a dilapidated hovel in which to sleep, was in no mood to discuss work. Unquote. Claude Bowers, The Tragic Era, 1929. And according to David Lewis, in his magnificent two-volume biography of Dr. Du Bois, which won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, in 1929, the pioneering feminist Anna Julia Cooper, one of my favorite authors, who at the time was the principal of the M Street School, the famous M Street School in Washington, wrote to Du Bois, urging him to write about Reconstruction in a way that would forcefully respond to Bowers and the Dunning School. She said, "Thou art the man to do it." I love that. And then he did it. The biggest surprise when I was making the film that Eric and I made about Reconstruction, the biggest surprise for me was a quote I'm going to read from Martin Luther King. 6 weeks before he was assassinated, Dr. King made a speech about the significance of Du Bois's work, Black Reconstruction. And it was on the occasion of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Du Bois's birth. And this is what he said. To understand why his study of the Reconstruction, old school Black people would call it the Reconstruction. I want to make this clear to the young people out there. To understand why his study of the Reconstruction was a monumental achievement, it's necessary to see it in context. White historians had for a century crudely distorted the Negro's role in the Reconstruction years. It was a conscious and deliberate manipulation of history, and the stakes were high. The Reconstruction was a period in which Black men had a small measure of freedom of action. If, Dr. King continued, if, as white historians tell it, Negroes wallowed in corruption, opportunism, displayed spectacular stupidity, were wanton, evil, and ignorant, their case was made. They would have proved that freedom was dangerous in the hands of inferior beings. One generation after another of Americans were assiduously taught these falsehoods, and the collective mind of America, Dr. King concluded, became poisoned with racism and stunted with myths. Martin Luther King Jr., 6 weeks before he was killed. And finally, one of the things that you'll discover when you read this book is that it's not a standard history. Nothing Du Bois did was standard, of course, but it's really a poetic meditation, both on the history of our people, on the history of the race, as we would say, and the history of anti-Black racism in America, but specifically between 1860 and 1880. And there are these long flights of poetic rhetoric, like the one I'm about to read, which characterize this work. It's a section of The Coming of the Lord, which is about the Emancipation Proclamation and its effect. The magnificent trumpet tones of Hebrew scripture, transmuted and oddly changed, became a strange new gospel. All that was beauty, all that was love, all that was true stood on the top of these mad mornings and sang with the stars. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. There was joy in the South. It rose like perfume, like a prayer. Men stood quivering. Slim, dark girls, wild and beautiful with wrinkled hair, wept silently. Young women, black, tawny, white and golden, lifted shivering hands, and old and broken mothers, black and gray, raised great voices and shouted to God across the fields and up to the rocks and the mountains. A great song arose, the loveliest thing born this side the seas. It was a new song. It did not come from Africa, though the dark throb and beat of that ancient of days was in it and through it. It did not come from white America, never from so pale and hard and thin a thing, however deep these vulgar and surrounding tones had driven. Not the Indies, not the hot South, the cold East or heavy West made that music. It was a new song, and its deep and plaintive beauty, its great cadences and wild appeal wailed, throbbed, and thundered on the world's ears with a message seldom voiced by man. It swelled and blossomed like incense, improvised and born anew out of an age-long loss, and weaving into its texture the old and new melodies in word and in thought. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Let me, I'm going to read a couple of brief passages from Black Reconstruction following on Professor Gates here. At the very end, this is really, both of these are from the last chapter. Du Bois says, I write in a field devastated by passion and belief. He's talking about Bowers, he's talking about the other racist scholars. Naturally, as a Negro, I cannot do this writing without believing in the essential humanity of Negroes, in their ability to be educated, to do the work of the modern world, to take their place as equal citizens with others. I cannot for a moment subscribe to the bizarre doctrine of race that makes most men inferior to the few. But too, as a student of science, I want to be fair, objective, and judicial. But armed and warned by all this and fortified by the long study of the facts, I stand at the end of this writing literally aghast at what American historians have done to this field. And that is an irrefutable indictment of the historical profession in this country and how it, for generations, produced work simply to bolster, to give it legitimacy to the Jim Crow system of the South. And then at the very end, another poetic passage from Du Bois. The most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of the dark beauty of their mother continent into the newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell, and in the 3rd century, they arose from the dead in the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen. It was a tragedy that beggared the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity, like the Reformation and the French Revolution. Yet we are blind and led by the blind. We discern in it no part of our labor movement, no part of our industrial triumph, no part of our religious experience. The centrality of Reconstruction to modern history, Du Bois insists on at the very end of the book.
That is spectacular. So I want to, this is a program intended to celebrate the new edition of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, edited by the two of you. But I want to pull back slightly even further and ask each of you, when did you first discover the book? Where were you? And what was its impact on you?
Oh, I remember vividly. I was an undergraduate at Yale, and I was taking my very first course in Afro-American history, 2 semesters, taught by William McFeely, who wrote, and at this time had written a biography of O.O. Howard, General O.O. Howard, who was first director of the Freedmen's Bureau, and then his biography of Ulysses S. Grant won the Pulitzer Prize. And all the Black kids took it. I mean, I hit the Yale's campus in September '69. There were 96 Black kids who showed up the same day. And by contrast, there were 6 Black guys who had graduated in the class of '66. And we had 96 Black men and women, including Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman, of course, from Barbara Jordan's seat. Kurt Schmoke, the first Black mayor of Baltimore. Dr. Ben Carson. We were all in the same class. And a whole bunch of hedge fund people and doctors and lawyers. And everybody took this course in Afro-American history, because remember, this was the first time these courses were being taught at many of the historically white universities. Eugene Genovese had taught this course before he had left to go to Rochester. So I was a sophomore. I was in that class, and they assigned parts of Black Reconstruction, particularly the propaganda of history. And that is Du Bois's last chapter, as Eric said, when he just indicts the racist ideology that is exemplified, made manifest in standards, histories of Reconstruction by white historians, particularly at Columbia University and centered on the Dunning School. And so I realized I had no idea, and they made us watch Birth of a Nation. And I had thought Birth of a Nation was about slavery, but it's not. It's about Reconstruction. It's about the evils of the South Carolina, particularly the South Carolina legislature, which in historical fact was majority Black. The lower house was majority Black. Speaker of the House was Black. Secretary, the treasurer was Black. South Carolina was ground zero for Black power. So Birth of a Nation was the filmic counterpart of this, the horrible renditions of our people's achievements or lack of achievements in the Reconstruction period that American historians were fostering. And Du Bois was deconstructing, without ever using that word, the racism at the heart of these historical, quote unquote, historical accounts of Reconstruction. So all of a sudden you realize that the most important thing perhaps that happened in Reconstruction, and there were several important things that happened, but perhaps the most, or one of the most, was the giving of the vote to Black men. And the most heinous thing outside of rape and murder was disenfranchisement, voter suppression. You could chart the rise and fall of Reconstruction through the power of the vote and then the stripping away of the vote, which is a lesson all of us need to heed right now as these Republican legislatures, particularly throughout the former Confederacy, are trying to disenfranchise our people. How about you, Eric? When did you first read it?
Yeah, well, Du Bois was, I grew up in a household where Du Bois was actually a friend of my parents. This was a kind of old left household. In the 50s, Du Bois, of course, was being blacklisted, denied his passport, denied the right to speak in all sorts of places as part of the Cold War. And my parents were part of that world that was suffering a great deal from this kind of persecution. So Black Reconstruction had a very privileged place on our bookcase in my house, but I didn't read it really before I got to college, where I had a wonderful history teacher, James P. Shenton at Columbia, who assigned it in a seminar, an undergraduate seminar in 1962, I guess it must have been, that I was taking on the Civil War Reconstruction. And Shenton always said that the chairman of our department had told him he shouldn't be assigning Black Reconstruction. It's not really history. And Shenton told him off and resigned it anyway. But I've read through it many a time since then, and there's always something that jumps out at you. Particularly what strikes me looking at it nowadays is how many modern, really up-to-date insights are anticipated by Du Bois in this book. You think you've got an original new idea, and there it is in Black Reconstruction in 1935.
No, it's true. I mean, when he has a concept he calls the American assumption.
Assumption, yeah.
Yeah, and the American assumption, well, now we would call it the wages of whiteness, right? That
unfortunately, I didn't realize, I called it the free labor outlook, and I didn't realize till later that Du Bois had anticipated me on that, except calling it the American assumption.
Yeah, he did. And he says the central conflict was between the believers in the American assumption of wealth through thrift, and I'm quoting him, white workers who embrace free labor ideology despite its shortcoming. They would rather be white. They would rather be white and poor than reach across the color line and extend their hand and foster their class interests. With Black people, they would rather the American assumption is that if I'm good and work hard enough, I can be rich, like the wealthiest one of the 1%, as we would say today. And he defined that. And instead
well, let's get back to that. I actually want to talk about that. But the first thing, can you guys just say why now? Right, the book was published in 1935. It has a kind of resurgence in the 1960s during the civil rights movement and the Black insurgency, and I would say even more recently with the kind of opening around capitalism and slavery studies and interest in the ideas of what is being termed racial capitalism, I think has created a new interest in opening around Du Bois's ideas. And so what are some of the conversations and considerations between the two of you that lead to this publication, this new edition?
Well, Eric and I basically made a film together, as you know, a 4-hour documentary. I mean, one of the favorite things that I've done. I decided, look, Reconstruction was 12 years of Black freedom followed by the alt-right rollback, okay? If you want it in a sentence, what's that sound like? 8 years of a Black president followed by what? An alt-right rollback. So I wanted to do a documentary. As I saw this happening while Barack was in office, I decided I wanted to do a documentary about Reconstruction as an allegory so that people could see through a mirror of history what was happening to us in real time. That the Black man, that beautiful Black family in the White House drove a lot of our fellow Americans absolutely crazy. And we saw it with the campaign of Donald Trump and the rise of Trumpism. So, and that's one of the great uses of history as an analogy, as an allegory. And so I looked around. I didn't have to look around. I picked up the phone and I called Eric and I said, I got the money to do a PBS documentary, 4 hours on Reconstruction, but I can't do it without you. Will you be the chief consultant? He said, I'm in. And we worked closely together. And we made a fabulous series, which won the DuPont Award from Columbia University. And I'm very happy about that because the Dunning School was based at Columbia. And what Eric has done is erased the Dunning School. Now we have the Foner School. And the Foner School is very Du Boisian. You know, Eric and Du Bois, you know, agree. One of the most interesting things that Du Bois did, and which was so controversial when he published the book, was to say that the Black people, the contraband, the Black people who ran away from the plantations and, you know, got behind Union lines, that was the only way that the Emancipation Proclamation could be effective, right? It didn't apply to enslaved people in the border states. It applied to people in the Confederacy. And if you could get behind Union lines, then according to the Emancipation, you were free. Du Bois called this the general strike. And it turns, it was one of the most controversial things that reviewers pointed to. How could you say 500,000 people engaged in this general strike? But now people take it for granted. There were 500,000 Black people who left the plantations, got behind Union lines, and got their freedom. And not only that, as he points out, we all know now that there were 200,000 Black men who fought in the Army and the Navy in the Civil War. Well, as you know, there were only 488,000 free Black people in 1860. So do the math. Those and 262,000 of them lived in the Confederacy, lived in the South and the border states, okay? So that leaves 222,000 people in the North. Well, all of those people who fought, all those men who fought the Civil War couldn't have come from the North. Overwhelmingly, Du Bois says about 150,000 of that 200,000 were people who were enslaved at the beginning of the Civil War, who got their freedom because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Most of them obviously were illiterate. And nonetheless, what did they do as soon as they became free? They enlisted in the US colored troops and in the Navy, and they fought for their freedom. I find that beautiful because many of us think, you know, you see all those posters of Frederick Douglass in Boston, men of color to arms. You think it was the free Black community that rushed to join the Union Army. Well, some of them did, but they were maybe maybe 50,000 of 200,000. You know, I'm making these numbers up. I'm quoting Du Bois. Eric will tell us what they really were. But the overwhelming majority were people who were enslaved on the day the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, who got their freedom and then fought for the freedom of the total 3.9 million enslaved men and women who were in the South at the start of the Civil War.
You know, Professor Taylor, in terms of your question, I've spent a lot of this pandemic the last couple of years answering questions about Reconstruction. People, it's serendipitous in a way that the reissue of Black Reconstruction comes right at this moment, because the issues of Reconstruction are still being fought out right now. Who is a citizen? Who should be a citizen? That's being fought out every day on the border of the United States and Mexico. Who should have the right to vote? As Skip Gates just pointed out, you know, the right to vote is being restricted in state after state in ways that are reminiscent of the disenfranchisement of Black voters around the turn of the century, 1900. What do you do about terrorism in the country? You know, on January 6th, a year ago, I remember hearing commentators on TV saying, oh, this has never happened. Mobs trying to overturn a democratic election. This has never happened before. We're in a crisis. But I used to, well, wait a minute. It has happened before. It happened a lot during Reconstruction. White supremacist mobs, the Colfax massacre, or later the Wilmington massacre, and other, you know, that this is deeply embedded in our society. And Reconstruction gives us an understanding of where all this comes from. You know, Du Bois is you know, has the analytical power to help us explain both what the achievements were, and as Skip said, you know, the violent backlash against Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is really still going on in a kind of odd sort of way, as is the backlash against it.
Yeah, and Du Bois says that the Compromise of 1877, of course, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which made Rutherford B. Hayes president of the United States, and the deal was that he would remove the remaining federal troops protecting the Black vote in the South. Du Bois says it created an alliance between white capitalist interests, Northern industrialists, and Southern planters. This is after 750,000 Americans were dead, killed, died from, you know, either in combat or from disease and infection, et cetera, et cetera. 750,000 Americans were dead by January 1st, by the middle of April, 1865, who were alive in the day before Fort Sumter. And yet, 12 years later, the capitalist interests in the North forgave the planters in the South, and they just cut the deal. It was, and Du Bois says, it was the money. It was the Benjamins. It was all about the Benjamins. Everybody, they decided to kiss and make up, and that their interests, they had more in common with each other than these Negroes, as they would have said, who were busy thinking that they actually could run state governments and that they were equal, and that the founders had meant them and included them, had envisioned them when they said all men are created equal, and that this, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's cold. Ex-slaves, the free Negroes before the war, and indeed all workers, according to Du Bois, lost out. And it was this fantasy of the wages of whiteness that kept the workers, whose natural allies were the poor Black people, from forming this alliance.
So what do we think about that? Because I think this is an important insight of Du Bois, and during this period, that to the extent that people understand the history at all, it is seen just as the triumph of white supremacy. But I think the power of Du Bois's insight is that white supremacy was a political project, that it wasn't just racism for the sake of racism. It wasn't just we hate Black people because we hate Black people, but that this was part of an overall objective of the ruling class, if you will, in both the South and the North.
Yes.
To essentially use racism, at least in the South, to divide this potentially new force of poor Black people, poor white people who had the potential to challenge the rule of the ruling elite in the South. And in the North, there's a realization that the power of the state being used to impose equality in the South at the behest of Black people then begins to raise critical questions about the lack of equality in the North.
Yes.
And so this is overall, this is about, will capital rule the day, you know,
Right.
or will there be a biracial democracy?
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, you're completely right about that. And, you know, Du Bois, like many people in the 30s, had been reading Karl Marx and Marxism and had become much more attuned to the sort of class analysis. He no longer was holding to his old talented 10th idea that, you know, an elite group of Black people would be the cutting edge of change. Now he saw working class people, Black and white, as being the ones who were going to make this a better society. And as Skip mentioned in one of his readings there, you know, Du Bois felt that the tragedy of Reconstruction was the failure of white labor to understand that its interests were tied up with progress for the former slaves. Instead, you had this wages of whiteness, as we said. But, you know, what's the title of the book, Black Reconstruction, tells you what it is. I mean, it's about African Americans as the key actors of Reconstruction. And yet, it's one of the remarkable things about it is he gives you the whole kaleidoscope of the society. He gives you the white working class, the farmers in the South and in the West, the industrialists, the class dynamics in both the poorer whites in the South, the class dynamics that are going on and how they shift during Reconstruction, which, as we've been saying, kind of ends up with a deal between Northern capital and Southern planters, which leave out the African Americans, certainly. So it's a very sophisticated analysis. Putting Black people at the center was itself a dramatic break with all the literature that had come before it, but he doesn't stop there. He tries to give you the whole question of the class analysis of the society, which is, you know, a pretty remarkable feat.
One of the ironies of the all the talk today about the 1%. Listen to these figures. In 1860, there were, I just looked these up this morning. There were 393,967 slave owners in the United States. Okay? 393,000. How many owned over 100 enslaved men and women? Between 100 and 499, 2,341. How many owned over 500? 22. 22. And Eric is one of the many things I've learned from Eric. And Eric has made me think about the fact that, you know, though Birth of a Nation represents the Reconstruction governments as Black, they were interracial. It was America's first experiment with true interracial democracy throughout the South. 90% of all Black people until 1910 lived in the South. And that was true in 1860. So this is where they were, and that's where men voted. And it was Black men and white men working together, doing the best that they could in 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, because Tennessee had gone back into the Union. And they were working hard. They created a public school system in the South where there wasn't a public school system, statewide public school system. And this was an experiment, I think, Eric, that just terrified these economic interests, that it tapped into deep-seated racism. You know, we think of the North as this place where slavery had been abolished, right? Well, guess what? Black men in the former Confederacy got the right to vote 3 years. 3 years, because of the Reconstruction Act, they got the right to vote, to register to vote in the summer of 1867. They got the right to vote 3 years before most Black men in the North got the right to vote, in which they only got the right to vote because of ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. Think about that. Black men in the North could only vote in 5 of the 6 New England states, couldn't vote in Connecticut and in New York if you had a $250 property, if you could satisfy a $250 property requirement. Pennsylvania, liberal Pennsylvania, was led the way in abolishing slavery. Forget it. That's amazing. And racism was deep and broad and with penetrating roots, which was easy to tap into. How effective was the rollback of Reconstruction? Here is one statistic that's mind-boggling. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority Black states. And for young people out there listening tonight, that is mind-blowing in and of itself. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority Black states, and Alabama, Georgia, and Florida were almost majority Black states. So Black population was in the 40%. That is Black power. That's real Black power. And starting in 1890, as Eric alluded, each of the former Confederate states had state constitutional conventions, and without mentioning the word race or Black or Negro, they disenfranchised Black males. How effective? In 1898, there were 130,000 Black men registered to vote in Louisiana. By 1901, that number was 1,342, according to Eric Foner. Now that, from 130,000 to 1,342 in less than 4 years. That is how devastatingly effective disenfranchisement. And that's why we have to be on guard against voter suppression, because the gains, the rights gained, can be snatched away, particularly with a conservative Supreme Court, which did its dastardly best as part of the power structure that took away Black rights.
Right. Let me ask you, and I want to circle back to some of this, but I want to pull back just a little. So right now, there are any number of political controversies, from the 1619 Project to the attacks on critical race theory. On the one hand, there's the ongoing controversies about reparations. There is the discussion now about not just how to teach about American history and slavery in particular, but whether we should be teaching this. Is this history just intended to make white people, white children feel guilty about the history of racism, of slavery, oppression in the US? The question I have is, why do you think the discussion about slavery as central to the history of the United States is so difficult in the first place? I mean, now is just is a kind of bubbling up of an issue that reappears periodically. But even beyond that, I always think about how, going to New Orleans, you would never know if you didn't know that New Orleans was the center of the US internal slave trade after the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. That New Orleans becomes the center of the internal slave trade in the US. You would never know that just walking through the streets of the city. If, there's a plaque here, there's a plaque there, that if you're attuned to it, you might see a plaque, but this is, you wouldn't know. And so in the US Capitol, where is the monument to emancipation or to slavery? So why is this history so difficult to tell, to understand in this country?
That's of course a very penetrating question. And we've seen in the past, few weeks and months how large numbers of people can be mobilized in opposition to teaching about the history of racism, the history of slavery in this country. I won't even dignify the debate over critical race theory. The people who are banning it from schools and places don't even know what it is, couldn't possibly define it. And, it's a graduate school or law school methodology. It's not being taught in 5th grade classes anywhere, but nonetheless, it's become a kind of a mantra, or what they used to call a dog whistle. But, more to the point really is, what is the purpose of education anyway? Is it simply to make people patriotic citizens who love America and think it has never, it's not done no wrong? Or is it to figure out how we got to where we are in the country right now? Why is there such a large gap between Black people and whites in, all sorts of indices, whether it's health, whether it's wealth, housing, employment? Obviously, is it, if you know about the slavery and Reconstruction and the overthrow of Reconstruction, you can understand why these gaps are still existing. If you don't know about them, well, you're going to fall back either that there's something wrong with these people, that, that they have had the same opportunity as white Americans and they kind of blew it. And, don't blame anyone for that except themselves. History offers you alternative explanations, but a lot of people don't want to hear that and become, one of the biggest complaints about quote unquote critical race theory is that it makes students feel guilty about being white. That is ridiculous. That's the opposite of what it teaches. It's not about individual racists. It's about structures. It's about the way racism is embedded in the laws and the judicial system, in many other features of our society. Students learning that, I think they are in a much better position to understand why our society is the way it is. But, it takes a certain kind of fortitude to be willing to say, okay, here is the answer to why there are so many inequalities in the society today.
Yeah, and some people don't want an analysis taught of the causes of those structures of inequality because they want to perpetuate the structural inequality, that you can't cure it unless you know the source of the problem. Slavery was brought back in new forms, neo-slavery. Slavery ended, the Civil War ended, Reconstruction rose and fell. And then, why? They needed cheap, cotton remained the leading export crop in the United States through the 1930s, I believe. They needed the cheap, somebody had to plant and pick that cotton. And they figured out a way just to reinvent slavery through debt peonage, sharecropping. This, the drill professor better than I do. And it's disgusting. When you look at the what I call the curve of class, and you compare the curve of class for the Black community with the curve of class for the white community. And there are other indices like the average amount of wealth for a white family as opposed to the average amount of wealth for a Latino family or a Black family. And you see these shocking discrepancies. Where did that come from? As Eric just suggested, you got two choices. Black people are lazy and ignorant, or there were structural causes, just innately that we are biologically inferior, right? Which is the racist dogma, or there were actual social, political, and economic structures that victimized our ancestors and kept us down. And that is what we need to teach. And as Eric said, this is not about making people feel guilty. I have a TV show when I'm telling people all the time that their ancestors owned slaves. And I don't try to I'm not doing it to make anybody feel bad. We're just talking about the facts of someone's ancestry. And as I said, there were 393,967 individuals who owned slaves in America at the beginning of the Civil War. That's a whole lot of descendants. And we need to know this. We need to know this history. Here's what Du Bois said should have been. And this is another way of answering your question. Once universal suffrage was achieved, the next step was to use it with such intelligence and power that it would function in the interests of the mass of working men, Black and white. To accomplish this end, there should have been in the country and represented in Congress a union between the champions of universal suffrage and the rights of the freedmen, together with the leaders of labor, the small landholders of the West, and logically, the poor whites of the South. Against these would have been arrayed the Northern industrial oligarchy, and eventually, when they were readmitted to Congress, the representatives of the former Southern oligarchy. This union of democratic forces never took place. On the contrary, they were torn apart by artificial lines of division. And what were those lines of division? Anti-Black racism. which runs under the floorboards of American culture today, just as surely as it did in 1865.
Absolutely. And doesn't it also raise a question about the nature of the society itself? So in that sense, what are Black people being liberated into, right? Because he describes a grotesquely unequal United States to begin with. And you're talking about the oligarchy in the North, the oligarchy in the South. And so to me, one of the things that is interesting when we talk about Du Bois's anticipation of this essentially modern reading of contemporary American society, one of them is a kind of unsparing view at American capitalism. And that seems to be as true today as it was in the 19th century and as it was in the 1930s when he's writing this text.
Mm-hmm.
As we've said, one of the biggest one of the biggest cottage industries in the history profession lately has been the study of capitalism and slavery, mm-hmm. which has illuminated the role of slavery internationally in the rise of industrial capitalism in the 18th, 19th centuries. In a sense, that's the challenge for analysis. You can't deal with one without the other. Mm-hmm. And Du Bois does it in this book. I mean, he makes it very clear that, that the issue of labor, the issue of land, the issue of access to economic resources is central to Reconstruction and is one of those areas where Reconstruction did not go far enough. The distribution of land, whether you want to call this reparations or some other thing, the distribution of land that was demanded by Black former slaves did not really happen. And that, led to, that created giant problems for them of poverty and, lack of economic independence, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, the evolution of American capitalism is something that is necessary to study in conjunction with slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. Well, ironically, they did try a form of reparations, which was Special Field Order Number 15 by William Tecumseh Sherman. And they actually redistributed land, as you know, along the Georgia Sea Islands, right? In South Carolina and Georgia. This was a marvelous experiment. One of the things we had to read in that course was Willie Lee Rowe's Rehearsal for Reconstruction. I remember it blew my mind. I was 19 years old. That I had no idea that there had actually been reparations. There had been land. 40 acres of mule and a mule was actually implemented for a time until Andrew Johnson sent O.O. Howard down to those Sea Islands to tell those Black people in the fall of
1865.
In 1865, right. He implemented it. He issued the order in January of 1865. The land is redistributed. People were starting to work it who had been formerly enslaved on that land. It was their land. And in the fall of 1865, he sends O.O. Howard down and tells them to tell those Black people to their face that they got to give the land back to the people who had enslaved them. It was horrible. It's like the whole hope of our people was the vote and the redistribution of land. And for a minute, we had it. It was going to happen. And then it was all taken away.
Okay, I've got audience questions on cue, but before we get to those.
You're the boss.
I know, exactly.
You got a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. You can do whatever you want.
I'm going to abuse my authority.
And by the way, I want to say congratulations.
Thank you.
Richly deserved. Richly deserved.
I appreciate that. What do you guys think the significance of Juneteenth being signed into federal law as a national holiday is? When it happened, I think that because of the context within which it happened, which was, erupting protests and demands for police reform and police accountability, that it for some people felt purely symbolic. Is there value in having a national holiday that recognizes the emancipation of slaves in the United States.
Well, you said yourself that you go through New Orleans and that the home of the Second Middle Passage, right? You didn't use that phrase, but that's what it was. Yep. And for those of you who don't know, in the audience, 1 million of our enslaved ancestors were moved from the Upper South to the Lower South between 1800 and 1860 because of the cotton boom and other things, but primarily because cotton became king. The greatest economic boom in American history was between 1830 and 1860, up to that time. And we couldn't import Africans after January 1st, 1808. So they, as it were, imported them from the Upper South. So my attitude is that the more Black holidays, the better. and if this is a way of raising a holiday in honor of the Emancipation Proclamation, because in a backhanded, curious way it is, then more power to it. Except so many Black people in my generation didn't know anything about Juneteenth. So we went to college because nobody celebrated it. You had Annette Gordon-Reed wrote.
Unless you grew up in Texas.
She grew up in Texas.
That's it.
Yeah. She wrote this book about, and all these people called me and asked me, tell me a Juneteenth memory. I had to be lying to make it up. Well, we went to the Juneteenth celebration. We didn't have nothing about it. I'd never even heard of it until I read Ralph Ellison wrote an essay about Juneteenth and the terror. And I wondered, what the hell is Juneteenth? And then,
oh my God.
But now everybody knows about Juneteenth, and it's a good thing. I'm trying to get every day to be Black History Month. So I'll take whatever tools the Congress will give me for whatever reason. Eric, what do you think?
The more holidays, the better. In New York City, we're at the Schaumburg here, more or less. It's the alternate side of the street parking is going to be suspended, and everyone in New York celebrates that because you don't have to move the car. We don't care what they're celebrating, but yeah, I agree. It's symbolic, of course. It's not going to put food on people's table, but the symbols are important. The statue of Robert E. Lee is a kind of symbol, right? It's better to have Juneteenth celebrated than Confederate Memorial Day like they do in Alabama or Mississippi,
which is sickening. Schools are where we learn how to be citizens. And what did I learn? First grade, my country 'tis of thee. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. America the beautiful. All that stuff, the Star Spangled Banner, you learn all that stuff. We had to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every day in school. I don't know about your generation. And Eric, I don't know if you were a red diaper baby. I don't know if you were burning the flag in your household.
I was a black diaper baby, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid in our school, we just saluted the flag like anyone else. That's okay.
Okay. Well, all of that is like, that is like through osmosis, you learn what being an American is, right? You imbibe the ideology. So that's why the battleground over the curriculum is so fierce and ferocious. Because what those of us who are in this Zoom session are trying to do is change the curriculum. My colleagues and I edited the Norton Anthology of African-American literature, and we published it in 1998, which revolutionized how African-American literature could possibly be taught in the curriculum. Because then no teacher could say, oh, I can't get all those texts by Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston. It costs too much money. We put the course in the text. This is a political action. This is a tribute to our literary heirs, of course, but it is politics. The curriculum is one of the most contested arenas in America today, as Eric was saying, as you were saying about so-called critical race theory. What they've done consciously is empty critical race theory of any meaning and dump anything, the teaching of anything Black is in the scare quotes of critical race theory, and it's some evil thing. It's kind of like the communist scare. Like communism coming, critical race theory.
It's because the word race is in there. If it had been critical social theory or something, they wouldn't have cared. Critical race theory makes people frightened, even though they have no idea what it is.
Right.
No, it's like you Black people are critically erasing us.
All
You're
right,
calling us racist.
let me get to at least one or two of these questions. One of them is, could you all spend a couple of more minutes picking up a thread from the beginning of the discussion to talk about how iconoclastic Du Bois's counter-narrative was versus the likes of the Dunning School and the kind of dominant narrative of Reconstruction?
Mm-hmm.
Du Bois challenged the Dunning School and the general view of this period on every level. Number one, slavery was the cause of the Civil War. He starts out by making that very clear. That was not the general point of view at that time. It was either the tariff or it was just a blundering generation where there was no real cause. Slavery was central to American development. It wasn't just a footnote. That was iconoclastic of Du Bois in terms of historical scholarship at that point. Reconstruction, as Skip said at the very beginning, was viewed as a kind of travesty of democracy, the lowest point in the whole saga of American history. Du Bois says, no, it's a great moment in the history of democracy. We should be honoring it, not just dismissing it, as Bowers and many, many others did. The land issue, as we said, was critical. People didn't write about the land issue in Reconstruction before Du Bois. And even the way, just the research is iconoclastic, as he points out at the end of the book. Most of the writing on Reconstruction left out the voice of Black people. The key actors in Reconstruction were not even represented. Their speeches, their conventions, their legislation. Du Bois said, no, it's Black Reconstruction. We've got to look at the action of Black people. And Skip also mentioned before, emancipation came because of the actions of Black people. It wasn't just Lincoln signing a document and that was it. It wasn't just an army coming in and freeing all the slaves. It was the agency of Black people that got emancipation onto the agenda and accomplished. So all of those things are now considered, kind of standard interpretation, but at the time were really completely new in the historical literature.
And radical claims. Look, yes. I'm holding our edition, and chapter 1 is called The Black Worker. That was revolutionary right away. The Black Worker, chapter 2, The White Worker, chapter 3, The Planter, and then chapter 4, The General Strike, which is 500,000 Black people hatting up off the plantation and making it behind Union lines. And then The Coming of the Lord, from which I read. It turned the fundamental premises, the accepted wisdom about Reconstruction, each tenet of the Dunning School, he turned upside down. And the most important one was that legislatures, either dominated by Black men, by which I mean in which Black men were in the majority, like South Carolina, or when Black men were heavily represented in all those states that we talked about, that they did good things, that Black people comported themselves with dignity, that the 16 Black men who went to Congress between 1870 and 1877 were, exemplified intelligence and intellect and statesmanship, and they did good, as we would say. And these guys said that our ancestors were like ignorant and stupid and wanton and horrible. They just parodied all the achievements that Black men made during Reconstruction, and left out any contribution that Black women made. And we know Black women played a key role at every step of the way in Black history, but particularly in Reconstruction, organizing through the churches, getting men to vote, and, lobbying for Black women to have the right to vote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So.
One of the questions we sort of talked around, but do you see any potential for this multiracial coalition that Du Bois laments never comes together in the South? Do you see any potential for its revival or for its possible coalescence, given the same dynamics where you have ordinary white people who objectively may not fully benefit from the spoils of American capitalism, but then subjectively have not come to the conclusion that part of the solution of that, at least, is rejecting racism and joining forces with ordinary Black people.
You mean if we will
we
ever
are
get
in
behind...
we are in a very unusual political situation right now. The Black people want to form the kind of alliances you talked about. They're in the Democratic Party in order to try to form alliances with white people who are not benefiting, so to speak, from the structure of the society. And yet, the fact is, in the last few elections, that the whites who have been willing to ally themselves with Black people tend to be more, not the laborers, but sometimes suburbanites, people living in more wealthy areas, college educated, etc. So the sort of notion of an interracial alliance has gotten skewed in a way where, it's whites of a sort of higher class who are willing to engage in that kind of politics. How that is to be combated is a very difficult question. Now, it is true, of course, Obama was elected twice. We know that. He never won a majority of the white vote in either election. Nonetheless, he did get a lot of white people voting for him. You can't win the election just by getting Black people to vote for you. So maybe there is, hope of somehow reestablishing that alliance somewhat. But I'm not a politician, and I'm not that optimistic, actually, at the moment anyway, about politics. I think we face a very difficult situation with the rise of all this white supremacist violence in the country, and the apparent effectiveness of campaigns against the understanding of racism and against reforming of the police, etc. The backlash we are seeing is very, very worrisome, to say the least.
Yeah, and it's the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of redemption all over again. I mean, not exactly in the same way, but in a way that echoes it. We are recapitulating this awful moment in American history. 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. 74 million people. I go like, what were they watching the last 4 years? Like, to get that idiot out of the White House. I said, thank you, Jesus. How many times have one of your friends said, we dodged the bullet, democracy dodged the bullet? And I'm serious. I'm talking about the fate of the republic. I think it was seriously in jeopardy, and he's in the wings. I keep saying, come on, Biden, come on, Kamala, come on, you can do it. You can do it. Pull this thing out, because I don't want that guy to come back. There were dark forces that were plaguing the future of our country, and it was scary. I was terrified.
All right. Well, before we close things out, I would be remiss not to include that the book also has other writings from Du Bois included. There are 4 additional essays. Do either of you want to say something quickly about those 4 selections for this edition?
Well, Du Bois had been challenging the official view of Reconstruction for a long time before Black Reconstruction. And so these 4 essays, which are a little harder to find than the book out there, it's sort of Du Bois writing The Souls of Black Folk, of course, 1903. He talked about the teachers who went to the South. He talked about Black activism in the South. One of my favorites was 1910. It's at the end of this book. In the American Historical Review, his essay, Reconstruction and Its Benefits. And here's a little tidbit of information. 1910, Du Bois publishes in the American Historical Review. It takes 70 years for another Black person to be published in the American Historical Review, and that is John Hope Franklin in 1980. That tells you something about the trajectory of the history profession in this country in the 20th century. no Black author was good enough, supposedly, to be in the American Historical Review for 70 years after Du Bois was published. So this is the kind of thing he's trying to combat.
Yeah, and an essay published in 1924, The Reconstruction of Freedom, which is very rare. Most people don't even comment on that.
Right, that's hard to find, definitely.
You know, the other thing that we did was, Eric and I were laughing about this morning. I don't know, I'm sure you've noticed that Du Bois had this tendency to list people he was talking about, prominent people, only by their last names. Now, if you're talking about Aristotle and Plato, that's fine. But if you talk about all these people running around in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama, it's a pain in the butt. And I would wonder, who the hell? He would say, Taylor, Gibbs. And educated people were supposed to know what he was talking about. What we've done with the help of the brilliant staff of the Library of America is annotate all these names are restored for the first time, really. Yeah. This is not the first edition. I edited a series called The Oxford Du Bois, and David Levering Lewis did a marvelous edition of Black Reconstruction with a brilliant introduction. I commend that to everyone. But this book is now canonized by the Library of America. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of directors of the Library of America, and it's a great, it's a great honor and a great victory for a great man who's. Well, one of the things that we also, one of the big surprises is that this book was reviewed everywhere. This book was not published and disappeared. Just the opposite. Some people praised it. Time magazine trashed it. The Marxists trashed it. The Black Marxists and the white Marxists trashed it. They go, he don't know nothing about Marx. But other people, Ralph Bunche gave a searching critique. Abram Harris, who was a Marxist, gave a searching critique. But it was, and they printed 2,100 copies, and he sold, I think, 1,900 right, Eric? I'm remembering.
Something like that, but it didn't get into the universities, except for the Black colleges, you know. It didn't change, unfortunately. It took a long time for it to get assimilated and change the whole approach to Reconstruction. 30 more years, really, into the 60s.
It was the revolution, 1,984 copies by the year 1938, out of a first printing of 2,150. But it was the revolution wrought by Black studies in the academy. That's what brought it into the history departments. And that's where I was learning it from William McFeely in the survey course in Intro to Afro, you know.
Professor Henry Louis Gates and Professor Eric Foner, thank you guys so much for
you're very
really
welcome.
Excellent conversation tonight.
Thank you for being such a superb moderator.
Okay.
Thank you, Eric.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Novella. Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. I just want to remind everyone that you can order a copy of this new edition from the Schomburg Shop at schomburgshop.com. And also a reminder to sign up for our final virtual workshop with Mariama Kaba. And you can sign up at schomburgcenter.eventbrite.com. And I just wanted to do a special note and say, really, thank you, everyone, for your generous donations to the Schomburg Center during this time. We really appreciate your support. We hope to see you again soon. Have an amazing night. Thank you again, professors.
So long.
Ciao.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Happy Thanksgiving.
Have a good dinner. Enjoy the wine.